special plenary session on day 2 of the Indian Ocean Conference 2021. We have your fellow panelist and former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Honorable Sri Ranil Wickremesinghe here, and also foreign ministers of Sri Lanka and Cambodia are here. We have senior representatives from US State Department, your ambassador in Abu Dhabi, and also some senior representatives from Bangladesh and other countries also in the audience here. Friends, we will have Honorable Foreign Minister of Singapore addressing us virtually from Singapore. He will address us, and we have requested him to take a couple of questions from the audience. So after his address, I will keep the floor open for a couple of questions. That will be followed by an in-person address by Honorable Sri Ranil Wickremesinghe. Honorable Mr. Balakrishnan, floor is open for you.
Thank you for moderating this session, and I also want to acknowledge His Excellency, the former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Sri Ranil Wickremesinghe. I wish we could meet in person. It's been some time, but at least we still get to interact virtually. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the government of the UAE, of course, the India Foundation, and the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies for organizing, this is now the 5th Indian Ocean Conference. I recall that Singapore hosted the inaugural conference in 2016, and it's an honor to participate again as one of the co-vice chairs. Excellencies, the Indian Ocean has been an essential conduit for trade, culture, religion, language, and geostrategic influence over the past 5 to 6 centuries. And thus the theme for today, ecology, economy, and the epidemic, is very salient. COVID-19 has accelerated, in fact, the many pre-existing trends. And these include nativism, nationalism, anti-globalization. The virus, in a very real way, transcends borders, race, language, religion, and even today, as we deal with the emergence of the new Omicron variant, perfectly illustrates this point. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And we have to contribute to the collective fight against COVID-19 wherever and however we can. Singapore developed the Trace Together app for contact tracing. In the early stages of the pandemic, I recall we had received many requests to replicate similar systems. We decided we would make its source code open, and we called it Open Trace. We made it freely available. We enabled others to adapt it to your own needs. We also published the Blue Trace protocol to promote interoperability across jurisdictions. Singapore has also been an early advocate for vaccine multilateralism, a term coined by Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. We co-chaired the Friends of the COVAX facility alongside Switzerland to support its work. And Singapore also contributed US $5 million to the advanced market commitment mechanisms, as well as our entire vaccine allotment under COVAX to our partners. Meanwhile, climate change is an existential threat, and developing countries being especially vulnerable. The Indian Ocean is warming up at a rate that is estimated to be 3 times higher than the Pacific. And these rising sea levels will contribute to extreme weather events, including more frequent floods in low-lying areas and severe coastal erosion. The multitude of flora and fauna that depend on our ocean will also be affected. And by this century's end, Singapore expects to experience more frequent and intense rainfalls, a rise of sea level up to 1 meter, and which will really place us at the upper bound of the global estimates. The recent 26th Conference of Parties to the UNCCC, COP26, underscored the importance of a multilateral, rules-based response. I was very heartened to hear countries raise their climate ambitions. It is also encouraging that the developed countries have committed to enhancing finance to help developing countries strengthen their resilience and to achieve their climate pledges. And Singapore will continue to support these multilateral frameworks, and we will be a constructive, fair, and honest broker. Despite Singapore's constraints as an alternative energy disadvantaged country, Singapore will continue to escalate our own domestic climate efforts. We have announced the Singapore Green Plan 2030, which is a whole-of-nation roadmap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and our own net zero aspiration. We aim to quadruple solar energy production by 2025, to decarbonize our energy grids through electricity imports, and to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles by 2040, whilst actively investing in low-carbon solutions. Beyond our domestic efforts, Singapore is committed to helping fellow developing countries implement our climate changes through our Climate Action Package, which was launched in 2018 under the Singapore Cooperation Program. We offer courses in areas such as climate science, climate mitigation, adaptation strategies, flood management, green finance, and disaster risk reduction. Let me now turn to the economy. As we focus on a post-pandemic economic recovery, we need to remain clear-eyed about the downside risks. The trajectory of COVID-19 is still uncertain, and the effects of waning immunity or the ongoing evolving mutations, such as the recent Omicron variant, remain to be seen. Meanwhile, global supply chain disruptions, coupled with a pickup in demand and rising energy prices, could spur inflation. The economic stimuli and the government support have provided the much-needed short-term relief, but will also have long-term implications on governments' sovereign debt. It is thus important for us to enhance cooperation to promote supply chain resilience. We used to organize supply chains on the basis of just in time, but I think we need to replace this with a concept called just in case. Free trade remains crucial for sustained recovery. We continue to strongly support free trade agreements such as the CPTPP, as well as the RCEP. These are inclusive, open agreements, and the door remains open for others to join the RCEP. Singapore also welcomes economies that are able and willing to meet the high standards of the CPTPP. The COVID-19 has turbocharged the digital transformation in all our countries, but we need to enhance multilateral cooperation in order to leverage these digital technologies to support and to achieve sustainable development and to close the digital divide. We're also looking into digital and green economy regional agreements. For Singapore, we have embarked on the ASEAN Smart Cities Network. We welcome our dialogue partners present today to collaborate with us on this endeavor. The nexus between the economy and ecology is now very, very clear. For countries in the Indian Ocean region, travel, tourism, maritime transport, fisheries, and seafood production are key drivers of economic growth and recovery. A sustainable blue economy will support the UN's SDG 14 on the conservation and sustainable use of oceans, seas, and marine resources, and the global goals on poverty, jobs, resilient communities, and climate change. We need innovative financial instruments, including blue bonds, debt for nature, CSR investment, and blended financing. We should also foster collaboration between communities, businesses, and finance towards high standards of transparency. Ultimately, sustainability and accountability go hand in hand. They're based on the same value systems. Ladies and gentlemen, a key factor in regional peace and prosperity is our ability to cooperate under a rules-based international order. Many people have been disenchanted by the multilateral institutions and the processes that have in fact upheld the post-World War II global order. But we must resist the temptation to become populist or inward-looking in order to gain short-term political dividends. Because if we do so, we will burden future generations and set us all on a trajectory that is inimical to our own enlightened long-term interests. So we make the argument that an open, inclusive, rules-based multilateral world order is not merely a preference or an ideology, it is a necessity, especially for small trading city-states like Singapore, where our trade is 3 times our GDP. It is an existential imperative to keep the Indian Ocean open and peaceful. And even in competition, a rules-based international order will set boundaries and will allow for amicable dispute resolution. So it is in this context we welcome the US and China's statements to work together to deepen cooperation and to prevent conflict. We hope the major powers will find a modus vivendi that will enable cooperation in areas of common interest like climate change and free trade. In addition, frameworks such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea are absolutely key to a stable and inclusive region. The 40th anniversary of the adoption of UNCLOS next year will be an opportunity for all parties to reaffirm our commitment to UNCLOS as the primary legal instrument for oceans governance. Ladies and gentlemen, this pandemic will not be the last global crisis. While COVID-19 has taken a terrible toll, it also presents an opportunity for us to relearn the importance of banding together and finding collective solutions. As fellow countries vulnerable to the impact of climate change and reliant on trade for our economic well-being, we are all here at this conference because we have a shared vision of an Indian Ocean built on peace, security, stability, and prosperity. I look forward to a constructive dialogue with the goal of finding solutions that combine the diversity of our strengths, and look forward to your questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Excellency, for that comprehensive and very succinctly put presentation. You have highlighted rather you have cautioned us about populism and inward-looking policies of some of the leaders, and also your emphasis on rules-based world order and the significance of UNCLOS, especially when we are entering the 40th year of the UNCLOS. Its significance is very well taken. Before I open the floor for a couple of questions, I have one curiosity to know from you. You are in a way a global city. So the whole world looks up to what happens in Singapore. Can you tell us, is Singapore fully open for global businesses, global travelers? What is the status and what is the plan of the government? Can you just give us some information? You are not audible.
Singapore never shut down, never closed our borders entirely. We can't afford to. We need to import food, water, all the essentials of life. Supply chains remain open. And in fact, many passengers, and in fact, Indian and citizens of Africa and the Middle East will recall that even at the darkest moments last year, many of you transited through Singapore in order to get home. Many of its supply chains would also have gone through Singapore through the air freight or with sea freight. So the first point is that we never shut down. We can't afford to completely shut down. The second point is actually this controversial point about the role of having targeted, limited, time-limited restrictions on travel, because after all, the vector for this virus are human beings. So from time to time, there has been a plethora of rules, liberalizing or sometimes tightening up. So for instance, right now, I think with the advent of Omicron, many countries have imposed new rules. We are watching this very carefully. If you look at the position of Singapore, we actually have remained open. We now have vaccinated travel lanes, I think with over 20 countries, including India, I must add. And the key point here is that we believe this is a period that calls for increased caution, and in particular have imposed more tests. So if you come to Singapore, for instance, I would recommend you do what I do right now, which is I subject myself to an antigen rapid test practically every day. And that's because of the nature of my job and the fact of people I meet. The purpose of testing is not to protect myself. The purpose of testing is to protect the people whom I'm going to meet. So the point here is that there are ways in which we have to adapt and adjust to the demands and the challenges and the dangers posed by COVID-19. But stay open, stay transparent, be based on science and medical facts, and then explain to the population so that people understand the rationale behind what we're doing. And it's also important to understand that, this is a time of great uncertainty. No single government can get it right 100% of the time. We need the humility to accept that, and the ability to pivot and to change policies if need be when new facts emerge. So thank you, and again, I want to extend the invitation to you around. You must come to Singapore.
Thank you, Excellency. Now we can take a couple of questions. Yes, Ambassador Sajjanhar, you can use your mic. You will be audible. This is Ambassador Sajjanhar.
Good morning, Mr. Minister, and thank you very much for your presentation. Excellent presentation. My question is on what you mentioned, Mr. Minister, that the world really needs to reaffirm its commitment to UNCLOS 82, particularly when we come to mark the 40th anniversary of this institution. And I fully agree with you that the UNCLOS 82 represents the constitution for conducting our relations, global relations, as far as maritime issues are concerned. And India subscribes to it because a few years ago we had a case at the ICJ, at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. We got a decision which was not in favor of India, but we accepted it wholeheartedly. My question to you, Mr. Minister, is on this occasion, what do we do if there are countries, strong, powerful, who with impunity will not accept the decisions of under the provisions of UNCLOS 82? And that really those issues really have a potential to create insecurity and instability in the maritime domain in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very profound and pointed question. Let me answer it first from the perspective of a tiny city-state that is exactly at the interface between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. For Singapore, we believe in UNCLOS, we believe in multilateralism, we believe in a rules-based world order, because the alternative is might is right, big dominates small, and we are just little pawns to be manipulated or to be sacrificed. So the first point I'm making is that we believe in UNCLOS and a rules-based world order because that is the only arrangement or framework in which a tiny country like us, where trade is 3 times our GDP, can survive and thrive. That's first point. Your second point is, so what do we do about big powers? And the thing about big powers as opposed to small countries is that big powers have strategic options. They have the option of going it alone. They have the option, sometimes even when they sign on to multilateral arrangements, to not bind themselves to all the obligations that these multilateral agreements impose on them. This is a prerogative that big powers often keep to themselves. Now, what do the rest of us who are not in that league say? The only argument I could make to them, and which I regularly do when I meet, is to say, look, I understand that you, because of your primacy, have got options that the rest of us don't have. But spare a thought that we are evolving from a unipolar, not just to a bipolar world, but to a multipolar world. And one of the implications of a multipolar world is that when all power, or when there are multiple powers which are contending and jousting in pursuit of strategic interests and influence, in that sort of scenario, it may be better in their own enlightened long-term self-interest to agree to be bound by multilateral rules. Why do I say that? Because it enables the peaceful resolution of disputes. You gave an example, I think, for India, and I can give you examples from Singapore, where when we've had disputes with neighbors, we've gone for arbitration, or we've gone for resolution in international courts. We've won some, we've lost some. The key point is not to gloat when you win, or not to reject and throw a fit when you lose, but to take it with equanimity that we are complying with such a system in pursuit of peace, and a peaceful resolution of dispute in fact enables cooperation, constructive arrangements to be made, and ultimately a win-win outcome. So I'm afraid these are diplomatic arguments that we can make. We hope and pray that the superpowers and the emerging powers will continue to operate on the basis that multilateralism works and a rules-based world order is good for all of us. So I'll need you to keep making that argument at every forum that you are present at.
Thank you. We can take one more question. Yes. Please go ahead. Manjeev.
Thank you. Excellency, you talked about issuing blue bonds. There has been limited success even with the green bonds, and particularly with developing countries that actually need these instruments the most. Is there some way that Singapore is thinking about how to make blue bonds really workable, especially for developing countries? It's okay to do it in the developed world, but the countries where it really matters, it isn't that successful.
No, I think you've made a valid point that even for green bonds, we're not past the hurdle yet. I believe if you talk to young people, if you talk to companies and governments with a long-term planning horizon, there is interest. But if you just look in terms of maximizing short-term gain, there will be many cynics. So I think we're still in that phase when it's a rising tide, but we have not yet got over the hurdle, so to speak. My own view, and certainly the view that we are taking in Singapore, is that we do need to organize our economics so that it takes into account externalities. This applies particularly for green, and even in case of blue, because in the case, let's say, of overfishing or unregulated management of global commons, of which the oceans represents one. Actually, we all end up losing if everybody makes a scramble for short-term benefits. The argument which we have to make to investors is that, in fact, investing in companies with a long-term perspective is a safer investment and one that will pay off in the long run. I would say watch how, don't just watch our words, but watch our actions, watch the investment patterns. And you can also pay attention to, the comments that our own sovereign wealth funds have been making. Now, I want to make this point because it's important. Singapore does not direct the investment decisions of our sovereign wealth funds. They have their own boards. They have to do their own calculations. They know their mission is long-term good returns for the current and future generations of Singaporeans. But watch what they have said on this point and watch their investment decisions and the flows from there. It's important that people who make the argument for green and blue put their money where their mouth is. But I would say it's even more important that these entities succeed, because nothing makes the argument more strongly than success, and success financially as well. So it's, in other words, connecting responsibility, a long-term perspective with sound, rational economics, and then success. I think that will make the argument far more emphatically than any nice formulation of words. So let's wait and see. But I agree with you, we need to keep pushing on this front. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Minister. That was from Ms. Manjit Kriplani from the Gateway House, an economic think tank in Mumbai. Friends, thank you, Honorable Minister, for your time and very candid conversation with the participants. Friends, can we give a round of applause for Honorable Minister?
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Minister. We missed you this time in person. Look forward to your in-person presentation next time.
Certainly, certainly. See you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, we will move on to the other presentation of this session. We have with us Honorable Shri Ranil Wickremesinghe, former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, and also may mention that he has been associated with the Indian Ocean Conference right from the beginning. In the first 4 editions, he was the chair of the organizing committee. He continues to be a member of the organizing committee of the Indian Ocean Conference. Excellency, please.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, my friend Ram Mahadeva, without whom this conference may not have been possible, Sri Lanka's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Professor G.L. Peiris. Maritime trade between Arab and Indian sailors was flourishing even before the first references to it in the Shapta Brahmana, the Indian text of sacred knowledge. From then until the 16th century, the sea and land routes of the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula interlinked Asia, Africa, and Europe, forming a critical chain of supply. After a lapse of a few hundred years, today, the Western Indian Ocean is regaining its strategic position. It is therefore fitting that this Indian Ocean Conference is held in the UAE, a key player in the Indian Ocean region and outside. I thank the UAE government, which celebrated its 50 years of independence, for the hospitality afforded to all of us. Since our 4th conference in Maldives, an unprecedented paradigm shift is taking place in the Indian Ocean. The dynamics and intersections of ecology, the economy, and the COVID-19 epidemic have surfaced new transnational security challenges to the Indian Ocean region, the IOR, amidst intensifying geopolitical competitions. As a result, regional economies will undergo fundamental structural changes, having far-reaching impact on the future of this region. Climate change is occurring much faster than predicted and may cross the global warming level of 1.5 degrees centigrade in the next decade. The IPCC Assessment Report number 6, Climate Change 2021, the physical science basis, has revised the time frame for global zero emissions. The Indian Ocean is the most rapidly warming ocean in the world. South Asia will be the most detrimentally affected sub-region, where the retreat of the Himalayas, which feed 10 major rivers, will be catastrophic. Rising sea levels will put many coastal areas in South Asia at the risk of flooding. The anticipated plight of the Maldives is already known. Yet, despite significant progress in renewables in Asia, China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia and Vietnam, the target dates for eliminating emission goes beyond 2050. Given that economic growth in the region is being powered by India, Indonesia and Bangladesh, we are caught at an intersection where the economy and ecology comes together. Coal is required by these countries for sustained economic growth. Yet the utilization of coal beyond 2050 will accelerate global warming. The Glasgow COP26 World Leaders Summit's breakthrough agenda, with its prolonged discussions on phase out and phase down, further highlighted the predicament of this region. Even if emission cuts begin immediately, the GDP shortfall will be between 3 to 12%. These cross-cutting challenges of ecology and economy have been brutally intersected by COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused a global economic slowdown, a possibility that was unthinkable at our last conference in 2019. Thus, the economic costs of achieving net zero emissions are crippled by the economic cost of COVID-19. The devastation of COVID-19 on human health and well-being have been compounded by the adverse effects of climate change in our region. In fact, the erratic monsoons, increasing droughts and reduction of fish stocks arising from the changes to ocean water is poised to bring about food scarcity in the coming years. And of course, the strain on health systems and public finances are and will be endless, given the persistent mutations of the virus. The total global economic effects continue to mount. We are all aware of how the recurrent lockdowns have driven large numbers of people into poverty, and many others who are on the threshold of middle class to subsistence level. The overloaded health systems are neglecting the treatment of other illnesses and diseases. Therefore, most countries are increasingly vulnerable to other epidemics that easily become pandemics. The national education systems are disrupted. Furthermore, the resources for education in some countries are being reduced to increase the allocations for health. It is also disrupting the social fabric of all countries, including an increase in reports of addiction and domestic violence. There will be an accrual of these and further costs, given the culmination of the destructive impact of the pandemic in escalating social and political tensions. According to the IMF, estimates of the economic consequences of the pandemic include: 1. The per capita income of many countries in the IOR will stay below pre-pandemic levels for several years. 2. Rising debt levels with less room for potential borrowings. 3. Sharp reductions of revenue. And 4. Currency depreciations. The rise of US interest rates will further add to the debt burden of these economies. Yet, apart from these economic shocks, the loss to Asia from climate change is 5 to 6 times greater than our Western counterparts. The ensuing human displacement, migration, and construction of new human habitation caused by the ecological changes will be an intolerable burden on the affected countries in a region given their limited resources to combat climate change. Depressing as it is, we need to understand that a further downturn of our economies will reduce the resources for development already being eaten up by the increasing ecological and pandemic costs in an intersecting downward spiral. Yet, we cannot discuss the IOR without accounting for another intersection, that of geopolitics. The simmering power rivalries between the US and China in the IOR. This picture becomes even more complicated by the addition of AUKUS military alliance, which also covers the Indian Ocean. These developments in an increasingly multipolar world order will bring about regional instability in the Indian Ocean. The entanglement of great power rivalry in the Indian Ocean risks removing the focus on the public health shortfalls, digital inequalities, education disparities, unemployment, and social fragmentation in some of our countries. The end result will be a further destabilization of the IOR. A post-COVID-19 global economic turnaround will be determined by the time frame of the vaccine rollout, not only in advanced countries, but in all countries. The COVAX arrangements to supply vaccines have been wrecked by the advanced economies capturing the vaccine market and stockpiling vaccines. India's output is required for domestic needs. Therefore, the emerging and developing economies of the IOR are lagging behind. Some have yet to vaccinate half its population. The low vaccine rates in southern Africa led to the emergence of Omicron variant that is currently reaching the shores of many countries. Thus, ironically, the output of the advanced economies, which benefited from an early vaccine supply, are forecast to exceed the pre-pandemic level output. Never have countries become more conscious of their interlinkages to and dependencies on one another. The delay in vaccine supply for IOR countries, as well as the delays in providing financial policy support, will result in a medium-term output losses. The resulting divergence in the economic development prospects between advanced economies and the IOR economies will only widen the gap that has to be bridged by the region's economy. Thus, the emerging picture is not at all favorable to the IOR, which is already failing behind on the implementation of the sustainable development goals. The intersecting economic setbacks from COVID-19 and the impediments from accelerated climate change, as well as the US-China rivalry, have a potential to becoming a critical drag on this region that could prevent its potential to be the next global economic growth pole. In such a scenario, the growing presence of advanced economies of Europe as outside players in the region could result in a throwback to the 17th and 18th century Indian Ocean scenario, with more powerful outside powers dominating the weakened Indian Ocean states. This is a wake-up call for our region, for effective regional cooperation. The lack of a regional architecture and its underpinning structures were discussed exhaustively at our third conference in Hanoi. The need for new cooperative architecture was also highlighted at the Goa Maritime Conference conclave recently. We have to now move forward without delay. We have to address the lack of complementary among our regional economies to bring about economic cooperation and trade integration. The IOR is the least trade integrated region in the world. Diverse economic cooperation structures will require multi-layered regionalism. We have also to focus on the role of IORA. The southern and the East African countries of the IOR have sub-regional economic cooperation arrangements as well as the African Trade Agreement. The ASEAN countries are all members of RCEP. In addition, some are also members of the CGP-TPP. This sub-region is covered by GCC. The most populous and important sub-region from Iran to Bangladesh is left uncovered. India will become the second largest global economy, while Bangladesh and Pakistan will also be leading economies by 2050. The SAARC has yet to hold the next summit. Much more ground has to be covered before BIMSTEC reaches this stage. Without a trade agreement covering this sub-region, there can be no meaningful economic cooperation in the IOR. Such a trade agreement need not be as difficult as the search for the Holy Grail. Establishing a regional architecture to promote regional agenda to address intersecting challenges of the IOR's economic cooperation, climate action, geopolitical security, and now the global pandemic must be our priority. A regional agenda which includes the following points. 1. UN General Assembly discussions on COVID-19 to be continued to reach an agreement on a common agenda and a protocol for the mitigation of pandemic at global and national level. B. Negotiations with the IMF to provide additional fiscal space for heavily indebted regional economies. 3. A demand for action to immediately establish a US $1 trillion climate change fund. This is really pocket money because the cost of climate change is supposed to be about $100 trillion US dollars. D. A formulation of a two-pronged approach to address decarbonization by accelerating decarbonization both on the basis of per capita income emissions as well as countrywide emissions. The IOR regional agenda must be strong enough to ensure stability in the Indian Ocean by preventing militarization. Asia is at the starting line of an arms race with emphasis on aircraft carriers, nuclear-powered submarines, and fifth-generation combat aircraft. If ignored, such a race would divert much-needed funds for climate change. Therefore, the regional agenda must include effective maritime governance, including freedom of navigation and undersea cables. It must be an agenda to ensure stability by preventing militarization. This is IOR's fifth conference. Given the uncertainties of the future, this is when we should commence to walk the talk. On flanks of the IOR are the APEC and the African Agenda 2063. Without an architecture of regional cooperation to implement an integrated and effective regional agenda for climate action, economic growth, regional security, and pandemic mitigation, IOR's aspiration to be the next global economic growth pole will never be fulfilled. Therefore, we must act without delay. The starting point is the need for a summit of all Indian Ocean leaders sooner than later. The fate of the Indian Ocean is in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellency, can you take a couple of questions?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Excellency, for especially highlighting the challenge of big power rivalry in the region so candidly and so openly. And as rightly said, it is not only causing regional instability, but also impacting adversely the countries in the region. And also thank you for laying out a roadmap for Indian Ocean region. Friends, we can have a couple of questions. Yes, Asha Jadeja, you can go ahead. Switch it on.
Thank you, Ranil. A question I have is that as the world moves right now from a unipolar to what many of us, at least in the US, think it's moving to a bipolar state, is there any way that smaller countries in the Indian Ocean can take certain actions which strengthens the possibility of a multipolar order as opposed to bipolar? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. I don't think it will be bipolar. It has to be multipolar. If you take the BRI, it's not only China. So many other countries are being involved. You take the Quad. Why was the Quad there? Because USA couldn't manage on its own. Then we have other players. So I think we have to strengthen ourselves to go for the multipolar world. And then this part of the world, the Indian Ocean, must be very, very specific. A good example is ASEAN. ASEAN centrality is now being accepted by the US. I think Indian government had put out saga for this area. So it's a question of making multipolar and not bipolar. Is that rivalry that's coming up between US and China can be controlled if you have a multipolar world.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Excellency. Just 1 minute, a small formality from our side. Thank you for your presentation. May I request Mr. Ritesh Ramakrishnan of the Transworld Group, a leading shipping group, to come and present a memento as a token of appreciation to Excellency Ranil Wickremesinghe. Thank you. Friends, we will end the first special session of the day today. We are not taking any break. Just in 5-7 minutes, we will start the first plenary of the day. We have Honorable Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka and other speakers already ready here. We'll start immediately. Don't go away.
Plenary, and we will start with my invitation to the Honorable Foreign Minister on the subject matter.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and the sharing of information, narcotics, which is a problem afflicting some of our countries. These are the themes that warrant close attention in the world in which we live today. In order to add a slightly different dimension to our proceedings, I thought of sharing a few thoughts with you on the decision-making process in Sri Lanka with regard to these issues. When COVID-19 hit us, we were totally unprepared, as indeed the rest of the world was. Even basic things like social distancing, face masks, it took time for people to get adjusted to these precautions. Sri Lanka was convinced from the very outset that the real solution to this problem lay in vaccination. But at the start, we had difficulty in obtaining the quantity of vaccines that we needed to protect our population. Today, Sri Lanka's performance is one of the best, not only in the region, but globally, with regard to the availability of vaccines for the overwhelming majority of our people. But that did not happen immediately. But even when, within a few months, we were able to get into the country a reasonable quantity of vaccines, it was still far from sufficient for our requirements. So the first decision that we had to make as the government of Sri Lanka was, on what basis are we going to distribute the limited supply of vaccines that we had at our disposal? Several competing criteria were considered. One, of course, was the age criterion. People above 60 or 65 would be entitled to priority. But there were other views which had to be taken into account, both by the Cabinet of Ministers and by a task force which was specially appointed for this purpose. Apart from age, do we need to consider other factors like segments of the population which are constantly moving from one part of the country to another? Bus drivers, taxi drivers, fish and vegetable vendors. Would they be entitled to some degree of priority in order to contain the spread of the virus? So there was a good deal of discussion. And finally, we settled on a mix of these factors. Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, Foreign Minister of Singapore, told us a few minutes ago that no country has got it 100% correct. That is entirely correct. One of Sri Lanka's faults, as it were, if we look at ourselves in a spirit of candor and introspection, one of our initial errors of judgment, it was a natural error, was to overreact, shut down the whole country in the belief that that was the best way of protecting our people. So Sri Lanka was shut down continually for almost 2 months without interruption. It served its purpose. We were able to stem the tide, but at a cost, and perhaps an exorbitant cost. It had a horrendous impact on the economy. People were deprived of their incomes and their livelihoods. Government of Sri Lanka, therefore, had to embark upon a rather extensive program with regard to welfare. We had to distribute monetary resources to the most vulnerable segments of our population. Obviously, that is not a sustainable policy. It can be done where There's an acute need for a short period of time, but it's not something that you can do for a long period. We also had to take into account as a central factor the needs of industry, the people who provide employment for our people, commercial institutions, banks, and most important of all, companies that are vital from the perspective of Sri Lanka's exports. How do we address that concern in a manner that does not conflict with the paramount need to protect the health of the nation? So we evolved empirically through a system of trial and error, via media. Lockdowns were necessary, limited lockdowns, but designed in such a way as not to inhibit to an unacceptable extent restrictions imposed on the business sector. Now, one of the reasons why Sri Lanka was able to find its way out of the woods in a relatively short period of time was the intrinsic strength and the resilience of our private sector. I'm sure the Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe, former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, who took a particular interest in the economy, I'm sure he would unreservedly agree with me that the private sector of Sri Lanka has displayed remarkable adaptability and strength in these excruciatingly difficult circumstances. Sri Lanka's major source of foreign exchange is the export of apparels, garments, that has now overtaken tea. But at the time it was conceived, and Ranil had a key role to play in it at that time, our companies made a conscious strategic decision. Because we could not compete on economies of scale with other larger countries, our companies decided to concentrate on the production of commodities for niche markets, high-end commodities, lingerie, sportswear, swimwear, that kind of thing. And some of our companies like Brandix, MAS Holdings, have become not just regional leaders, but global leaders. But when COVID-19 hit us and transformed economic patterns, supply and demand throughout the world, our companies recognized the need to make fundamental adjustments with regard to the kinds of commodities that they were producing. They made an opportune and dramatic shift from the kinds of things that they were accustomed to producing to entirely new commodities, very innovative, forward-looking, personal protection equipment, for which they received very large orders. For instance, a National Health Service in the United Kingdom placed a very large order. Equally, the United States of America. So our larger companies received so many orders that they couldn't service all these themselves, and they found themselves in a position to farm out some of this to smaller companies. The result is that